Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 181. This week the questions are taken from guide 232 on the Australian ship Cerberus and on the Guadalcanal campaign Battle of Tassafaronga Wednesday video. So let's get on with the questions. Scott Mason asks, you mentioned that Cerberus was built for the protection of Melbourne. Did any of the other states have similar vessels, and how were the various state fleets combined to form the Royal Australian Navy? Were there any issues when the Royal Australian Navy was formed, seeing how there was some rivalry between the states of New South Wales and Victoria? So none of the other Australian states had a vessel of the same scale and power as Cerberus. They all had various others, and I will at some point this year hopefully be doing a video covering all the various ships of the various Australian colonies' navies before they became the Royal Australian Navy, mostly thanks to the fact that over in Australia there has very recently been published a book on all of those ships, which actually, collates all that information into one place and gives a bunch of information that previously wasn't known. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to acquire a copy of that, and so thank you very much to the people over in Australia who organised that. But obviously can't cover all of that in 5 minutes in a dry dock. But nonetheless, Cerberus was the most powerful ship. They also did have a form of first rate, believe it or not, which was progressively cut down during its career from 3 decks to 2 decks to 1 deck, and then eventually ended up as a coal lighter of all things. But the Victorian Navy, i.e. the Navy of the state of Victoria, was pretty much the most powerful of the various Australian states' navies. So when they were all combined, it was, to put it not quite so delicately, it was more kind of, here is, at one point, the Commonwealth Naval Forces, rather than directly becoming the Australian Navy. So March 1901 is the Commonwealth Naval Forces, and then towards the end of the decade of the 1900s, it becomes actually the Royal Australian Navy. But anyway, when the conglomeration is formed, it's basically the Victorian Navy plus various ancillary small craft destroyers, gunboats, that kind of thing from some of the other states. And then once that's done, then you have to take an inventory and kind of work out, okay, well, all of this, what's still useful, what isn't, what capabilities are we duplicating, and so on and so forth, and then move forward with attempts to standardize across the fleet. In terms of issues forming it, there would have been obviously some tension, getting all the command structures all in line, making sure which ships are going to be, as I said, kept, which ships are not going to be kept, and so on. But I haven't yet come across any significant sort of almost, if you like, game-stopping tensions between the various navies. Yes, as you said, obviously, there were tensions between some of the states, but, there's tensions between the states prior to them becoming Australia as a whole, and then getting together and actually sorting everything out to figure out how they're going to move forward as a single united navy. Martin Jones asks, would it be financially viable to raise, recondition and refurbish the Monitor to her original service state and turn it back into a museum ship like they did with SS Great Britain in Bristol? Now, given that this was in the question about Cerberus, I'm not sure whether you mean the Monitor Cerberus or you mean the Monitor USS Monitor. But in actual both cases, my answer is the same, which is yes and no. In both cases of Cerberus and Monitor, the hulls have deteriorated quite significantly, and so you're not going to be able to hoist them out of the water and move them about, I don't think, not under their own power, but in one piece. So if you look at something like the recovery of SS Great Britain, yes, when the hull's towed back into Bristol, it's on a barge, but for better or worse, for the most part, the hull is largely self-supporting. It is obviously in a cradle and everything to stop it falling over and falling apart. It's not entirely structurally sound, but it's mostly there. Whereas if you raised the actual hull of either Monitor or Cerberus, I strongly suspect it would break apart from the stresses that you're putting on it, because both those hulls, they've been down under the water for a considerably long time. Great Britain obviously also was left abandoned for quite a long time, but wasn't completely submerged. And also, as iron decays, especially the kind of iron they were building ships out of in the time period that we're referring to, it gets not just progressively weaker, but the way that it rusts actually makes it almost exponentially weaker the longer it goes on. There's a very complicated materials science explanation to be had there, perhaps for another time. But also, as I said, parts of the hulls of both Cerberus and Monitor have already collapsed. So what you'd be getting back, if the remaining major components held together, which is something of a big if, is a shell. And a lot more of a shell than SS Great Britain was. So it wouldn't be so much like recovering SS Great Britain or even Warrior for reconditioning or refurbishing. It would probably be more like recovering Mary Rose, i.e. you'd be fishing up bits of a ship that probably aren't going to be in a shape to incorporate into a new or refurbished kind of Ship of Theseus type display vessel. So while I think, yes, if you were incredibly lucky, you might be able to salvage either Monitor or Cerberus, although I wouldn't be holding my breath on either of them. You might be able to bring what's left of them ashore. It would require a very intensive course of treatment, and it would effectively be you have a wreck. And you can put that wreck on display, but you're not really going to be in a position, I don't think, to refurbish it the way that Great Britain or Warrior have been. HS asks, the German ships of World War II seem to have generally inferior anti-aircraft weaponry compared to their Allied contemporaries, and be less than adequate in anti-air defence. If you were in charge of German ship design, what would you do to make German naval anti-aircraft defences up to par with or superior to their Allied contemporaries? So, leaving fire control systems aside, which is their own separate argument, if I'm having to improve the actual anti-aircraft guns and mounts themselves, there's three things that I would be going for. Firstly, simplify the mountings. So one of the major problems that some of the heavier German anti-aircraft gun mountings had was, in theory, on paper, they were these absolutely wonderfully triaxially stabilized, semi-remote power-controlled mounts that, all singing, all dancing, everything superior to everyone else's. And much like the Italian 90mm heavy AA mounts, ended up breaking down all the time, which is not really a good thing to have happen to your primary anti-aircraft defense. So rather than have the 100% perfect, extremely complex, but always breaking down gun mounts, I would just say, let's just have a 95% as good, relatively simple gun mount that won't break. Yes, that might not be quite as technologically complex and quite as capable when it's working as the latest and greatest stuff, but my design will always be working. So, is probably more useful in the long term. So simplifying that. Also, simplifying it will mean you'll be able to manufacture more of them. Second thing would be get a better 37mm AA gun. Good grief, the 37mm that a lot of German warships entered the war with, which is their medium anti-aircraft gun, their rough equivalent of the Bofors 40mm, is just awful. Either replace it with a better 37mm, which the Germans did have, or enter a licensing agreement with Bofors for the 40mm. One of those two things. But anyway, get a better, more functional medium anti-aircraft gun. I don't care whether it's 37 or a 40mm, just something that has a half decent fire rate would be a big step up. And then finally, the biggest issue it would, for me, be decide on a heavy AA dash secondary gun and stick with it. None of this split battery nonsense, because all it gives you is inferior protection, inferior armament on both sides of the equation. So if you look, for example, at a Bismarck class ship, which is obviously the biggest ship the Germans built, they have a dozen 150mm guns for anti-surface work, so 6 per side. They have 16 105mm guns for heavy anti-aircraft work, i.e. 8 per side. And then, you look at, let's say, King George V class. Okay, it only has 8 secondary guns per side, but they're 5.25 inch, not 4.1 inch. So they're firing a heavier shell. Each of those shells, therefore, does more damage. It's the same broadside in terms of numbers of shells, but the 5.25 inch hits a lot harder, and of course is dual purpose. And in the anti-surface role, there's 2 more guns than there are 5.9s. If you look at the American battleships, unless it's South Dakota, where you have 20 5-inch guns, 10 per side, so there is more guns per side in both cases, 2 more guns in the AA role, 4 more guns in the anti-surface role. Kind of speaks for itself, really. And, again, the 5-inch gun is a heavier thing than the 4.1 inch or 105mm gun, and it fires a heck of a lot more rapidly than the German 150mm. But if you look, again, going back to the Bismarck class's armament, if you add together the 5.9 and 4.1 inch battery, there are 28 guns there, which, the British total is 16, the American total is 20, so you're talking about almost double the number of secondary guns that a Royal Navy battleship has, and about almost 50% more than what even a US battleship has. And now, granted, some of that is just because, apart from the Iowa, Bismarck's much larger than all the others, but nevertheless, that's a lot of deck space and a lot of potential firepower you've got, and you end up wasting it to have both an inferior secondary anti-surface and an inferior secondary anti-aircraft battery compared to ships that actually get away with far fewer guns. So at that point, my argument would be either, if you want to go easy option, just say, what, stuff it, we're going to just accept a 105mm as our standard gun. Yes, it's only a 4.1 inch weapon. Yes, everyone else wants 5 or 6 inch weapons, but you know what? At minimum, even if we're replacing the 6 twin 150mm, and you could probably squeeze in at least 1, maybe 2 more, because obviously a 105mm mount is considerably smaller than a 150mm mount. But even if we just do a like-for-like replacement, we now have 28 guns per side. So, that's a lot of firepower being directed one way or the other. 14 guns per side. That's 4 more even than the 4.5 inch batteries on the Queen Elizabeth, Valiant and Renown. Also 4 more guns than on an Iowa, for example. So what you lose in perhaps individual hitting power with losing the 150mm, you gain in sheer volume of firing. Considering a lot of destroyers, 105mm gun is still equivalent to what a reasonable number of destroyers are still running around with. Okay, a bunch of them have 4.7 or 5 inch guns, but they have 4 or 6 of them, not 14 per side. That would be the easy option, and that would provide a lot of heavy anti-air cover. Or the alternative option, which is something I've mentioned before, is on land there's a 128mm flak gun. So rather than continue all this messing around, do work much earlier on the 127mm-128mm dual purpose weapon. Get that in and replace everything at that point. And at that point you can probably say, yeah, it's probably going to be a like for like, because the dual 128 or 127, whatever you want to call it, is going to take up slightly less space than when you're 150, slightly more than you're 105s. Hopefully it'll all average out, but again, you still have 28 guns, so they're 5-inch guns, except there's more of them even than on a US ship. That's going to give you a lot of heavy anti-aircraft firepower. So combine that with the fact that Germans aren't exactly slackers in the field of radar, etc., you'd have a fairly heavy layered air defence. I mean, obviously we're using the Bismarck as the epitome example, but you can scale this down across the board to other ships. But combine that with an actually fit-for-purpose 37mm or just licensed 40mm for medium AA, and your anti-aircraft defence has just gone up massively in terms of effectiveness. Sreko Kuvalo asks, did anyone try and make a monitor-like ship with enough freeboard to make it ocean-going, but able to fill some ballast tanks with water to make it a proper monitor just before battle? So, believe it or not, this was actually discussed a couple of times, well, quite often actually in the 1870s, and in one or two cases actually even implemented, or at least it was suggested that this could be implemented. No one went quite as far, at least as far as I'm aware, to build a full frontline battle unit with specific ballast tanks for flooding, but for a number of ships it was suggested, at least, as in the case of something like Devastation, and even Inflexible, that perhaps empty or partially empty coal bunkers could be flooded to literally hunker the thing down to provide less of a target. Exactly how serious those proposals were and exactly how well they would have worked is still somewhat left up to the imagination of the reader, because obviously those ships didn't actually see battle and therefore no one actually attempted it. But it certainly was a concept that the navies at the time were at least experimenting with, and that was partly in a, well, not so much in an attempt to reduce the amount of armour that was needed, because they were aware they would still need, full waterline armour for cases where the ships might be caught before they could flood themselves, or where the sea conditions might not recommend that particular course of action if you want to stay afloat. But it would, supposedly at least, lower the target profile of the ship. So, if you can't see the hull, you can't hit it. So the theory went, and therefore the only thing that would be available to hit would either be the breastwork or the turrets, which is a much smaller target profile than the whole hull of the ship. And I suppose in absolute worst case, if your breastwork was heavily riddled and you were taking on water, then at least if your pumps could keep up with the rate of flooding through those holes, you had some spare capacity, you could then, I guess, pump out the coal bunkers and raise the ship higher, which would then raise the holes that were letting the water in higher, which would then mean they hopefully wouldn't be letting water in anymore because they'd now be above the waterline. Which is a bit of a convoluted chain of logic and probably wouldn't have worked spectacularly well, but well, as you're probably appreciating from if you've watched the development of Ironclad series so far, a clear, coherent chain of logic was not necessarily always present when it came to designing ships of this time period. Edward Dunn asks, there's a photo from on board HMS Glasgow after an action showing one of the 4-inch secondary turrets with a large number of cartridge cases from the guns. What happens to these cases after they've been used? I imagine if it was in action they'd just be thrown over the side if they're in the way, but could the cases be refilled or melted down to make new ones, or were they just junk that needed to be removed? In an ideal world, you'd want to salvage the cartridges and bring them back, because depending on the type of gun you're talking about, you might be able to just send them back to a factory to be repurposed, reconditioned, or more likely recycled. And they're obviously brass cartridges. They would be fairly easy to reconstitute or recycle into either new cases or something else. And obviously in wartime, every bit of scrap metal, especially treated metals like brass, would be very, very useful. But at the same time, it was appreciated that you can't really necessarily have several tons of brass merrily rolling around the deck if the ship is on a war footing. So it would depend quite a lot on what the ship was doing. If the ship, let's say, was on an Arctic convoy run and was on its way back, or had been on a sweep through the North Sea, the Channel, the Bay of Biscay, something like that for the Royal Navy's case, or it was on a specific directed mission where it was going to go out from Espiritu Santo or Ulithi in the US's case and then head back again, then you'd probably try and keep or stow the cartridges around. But if you were on a long-term mission, let's say you're on an Arctic convoy and you were heading outward bound, you're heading towards Russia, or you're on a Mediterranean convoy run, or you're operating as a carrier escort for the US Fast Carrier Task Force or something like that, and you're going to be potentially under attack more than once in the near future, and you're going to be out and about for several weeks, then apart from maybe the odd person snaffling one for use as a ashtray or an umbrella stand or something, then most of the rest are just going to end up ditched over the side just to make way, make space, make sure the ship is completely sorted and ready for the next action. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, please can you talk some more about temporary bows? What materials and construction techniques are involved? Were crews trained to build them or given plans, or was it very much on-the-fly thinking? Did any ships end up having to make interesting journeys or go into combat with a temporary bow still attached? Well, it depends very much on where on the sliding scale of temporary bows you want to draw the line. And there's a sentence you probably thought you'd never hear in your life. But in any case, no, crews weren't specifically trained on how to build temporary bows. Crews were trained in how to shore up bulkheads, patch holes, etc. And to a certain degree, building a temporary bow is an extrapolation of those techniques. Now, the reason why I say there's a sliding scale is because you might have something like, say, USS Minneapolis here, which is, rather definitively missing a good section of the bow and therefore needs a brand new one. And then you get significant damage to the bow or partial damage to the bow. So at what point, how much of the original bow needs to still be there before it stops becoming a temporary bow and just a patch on an existing thing? Obviously, the more and more it's a patch, the easier it is to do with materials available to hand. And also, who is doing it? Because as we've seen with, some of the smaller ships that were at Pearl Harbor, or indeed some of the US cruisers that had their bows blown off and eventually headed back to the US, you can have several stages of temporary bows. So you can have the really temporary, put together to avoid the ship sinking type of arrangements made out of coconut logs, as per this picture. And then you can have a somewhat more formal looking, made out of sheet steel and girders and temporarily welded or riveted together bow, which the number of the US cruisers would receive in Australia before then heading back across the Pacific to get a proper bow fitted back in the United States. And obviously, depending on what materials you had available to you and where you're doing it, are you doing it in a random bay? Are you doing it in a shipyard that just doesn't necessarily have all the facilities to build you a brand new, complete bow as per your original plans? That's also going to affect the construction techniques, because you might, let's say, be using riveting, welding, all the stuff you'd expect, just not in a particularly standard way, or you might just have hand saws and whatever damage control equipment is available on the boat. So generally a lot of it is on the fly. It's, what have we got? Because there is no standard thing. There's even where you have ships of the same class, different ships might have different portions of their bow missing. Obviously in this picture the bow is missing forward of the foremost main battery turret, but in other ships that first main battery turret was completely gone. So how you're going to build a bow in those two situations is going to differ, even though the ship might be of ostensibly the same class. In terms of ships making interesting journeys or going into combat, I'm not aware of anybody having to go into a full-on combat with a temporary bow attached, unless you count fighting off the odd air raid. But in terms of interesting journeys, a lot of trans-Pacific journeys were made by ships that had some kind of temporary bow attached. Obviously, in the case of the ships that were the victims of Tassafaronga, they had to make the initial journey to Espiritu Santo and or Australia with their coconut bows, and then with the temporary metal bows they could then head back to the continental United States. And as I mentioned, some of, for example, the destroyer that was badly damaged at Pearl Harbor made its way from Pearl Harbor back to the United States with a temporary metal bow fitted on it. So, those are quite interesting. Although I would probably say, despite the fact that the temporary metal bows facilitated trips all the way back to the US, I'd actually say the initial voyages of, say, the ships from Tassafaronga are far more interesting, because the temporary metal bows fitted, whilst they obviously are not ideal, they are, in theory, pretty much mostly watertight. The main thing they affect is the ship's hydrodynamics, whereas the temporary wooden bows are much, much more dangerous if you are heading across the open ocean, because, as you can probably guess from looking at it, they're not 100% watertight, and obviously coconut logs aren't as strong as sheet steel and girders. What they're designed to do is quite different. So the temporary steel bow is designed just to get the ship, if somewhat inefficiently, home where some better repairs can be done, whereas the coconut log bow, or its equivalent in various other ships, is a thing to just hopefully prevent the ship from sinking. The bits that you can see here are designed to brace the hull and to shore up the bulkheads. If nothing else, when water crashes into the ship, it's first going to hit the coconut logs, so it's going to lose some of its energy and be dispersed before it crashes into the bulkheads behind. And then obviously, as you'll have seen in other pictures, there's also a kind of, sort of, if you like, proper stubby bow made out of coconut logs, which is designed to part the water a bit better. Now, obviously, as I say, they are weaker, they can move, they can leak, and they are shielding some very, very badly damaged bulkheads, which, if they give way, could result in the ship sinking. So even with these things in place, sometimes the ships would still choose to travel backwards to even further lessen the stress on the bulkheads. So I'd say those are probably the most interesting journeys, because you've survived the initial, catastrophe that's caused you to lose your original bow in the first place, and now, rather than kind of it being a do or die, you don't really have a choice. We're getting to X island to make temporary repairs circumstance. Now you've made your repairs, you're ready to go, and you're voluntarily setting out in 80% of your original ship to go across the open ocean with the somewhat questionable collection of woodwork that you and your mates have strapped together and stuck to the front of your ship, in the hopes that you'll get to somewhere which can do a somewhat better job of things. That's what I would define as a very, very interesting journey. So yeah, hopefully that gives you some idea of some of the circumstances that go into this kind of thing. Galdir Ionai asks, what was the approximate ratio of competent officers to complete idiots in the US Navy going into World War II? Because, well, Tassafaronga... Well, this is something I've alluded to before, and it's impossible to set an exact ratio in any given navy at any given time, because, there will be officers who perhaps start out the war as pretty useless, but through circumstance and luck don't end up in any kind of combat assignment until somewhat later in the war, by which point some of them will have had the opportunity to wise up a little bit. And then other officers who are very, very good might have spectacular misfortune very early in the war and thus be slated for that, even though they were actually probably just very good officers who just happened to draw a short straw at that particular point, and various permutations thereof. But fundamentally, it comes down to a navy that, and I know this sounds, it can be taken the wrong way, but hear me out. A navy that is at peace too long will end up going to war with a significant disadvantage. And the reason for that is not to say that navies should have a war regularly, but unfortunately it's down to more politics and human nature than anything else. Because in times of war, you want officers who can get the job done. Like, basic qualification. Can you defeat the enemy? Yes. Great. In almost all circumstances, unless the guy's a complete and utter psychopath, most navies will overlook almost anything else in order to let that officer go and do his job. I mean, so even someone like Nelson, would not survive in a peacetime navy, in my opinion. He was very nearly brought down, even though Britain was in an almost perpetual war with France at that time, just due to the social scandals surrounding his affair with Emma Hamilton. And the few snatched periods of peace that Britain got during Nelson's career, none of those particularly favoured Nelson or did him any benefit. And it was usually the outbreak of war that saved both his social and professional reputation and got him back in doing what he was actually good at. And you can look at all sorts of other officers, but fundamentally the thing is, the kind of free-thinking, if you like, maverick, troublemaker, whatever label you want to call them, is generally, not necessarily always, but generally is the kind of officer you want in times of war, because they will outthink the enemy, they'll outfox the enemy, they'll be very devious, very cunning, very determined, and so on and so forth, all these good things. But in peacetime, they're a nightmare to deal with for the bureaucracy. They're the kind of people who'll accidentally put a destroyer aground because they were trying some new high-speed manoeuvre through a harbour just to see if high-speed access to the harbour via something outside of the official marked channel was possible. In wartime, that kind of attitude is brilliant, because they'll look at an enemy chart and go, right, well, this is where the enemy has their defences covering the entrance to the harbour. But if we go here, we bypass it all, which is good. So let's try that. But as I say, in peacetime, they'll be trying that repeatedly, and eventually something will go wrong and you'll end up with a destroyer high and dry and everybody laughing at you. In peacetime, that kind of embarrassment, repair bill, etc., will probably cashier that officer's career. But then that means that come wartime, if you have peacetime going on for long enough, the officers who would be the ones, who putting ships aground and getting into all sorts of hijinks shenanigans, have all either been drummed out of the Navy or have learned to keep their heads down. And the officers who can dot all the I's, cross all the T's, do all the paperwork and are nice, safe choices, or perhaps have politically influential friends and so on and so forth, are the ones who drift to the top, because those are the only pressuring factors in a peacetime navy, thanks to, let's say, politics and bureaucracy. Except it turns out they're actually, not all the time, but generally actually either mediocre or pretty useless and actually fighting a war. And then you get a lot of people who end up dying because of those officers. And then, as war progresses and the rather Darwinian meritocracy of a world war tends to eliminate the fools, then all these ones who normally would have been drummed out of the service now rise to the occasion, and you get your good wartime leaders. And usually most of them can then work off of the basis of their achievements in wartime to sustain their careers post-war, and maybe they'll encourage the generation after them to be somewhat like them, but then the generation of officers after that slightly less, and then over the course of 10, 20, 30 years, you start to lose that edge. And this is seen across the board. It's not just a problem with the US Navy. The US Navy, I think, maybe exhibits it a bit more in the early stages of the Pacific campaign for two reasons. One, they're fighting against a Japanese Navy that has, to a certain extent at least, been at war for quite a number of years before December 7th, 1941. Granted, most of it is with China, and it's not exactly the world's greatest naval opposition in the 1930s, but there has been a certain degree of wartime pressure on the Japanese Navy, and the US Navy, aside from a handful of assignments at the end of World War I, hasn't seen any kind of major active naval combat since the Spanish-American War in 1900. So, you're talking about having to take things up to the level of someone like Admiral King before you get anyone who's actually had any combat experience at all, let alone relevant combat experience. And so you you get some rather unfortunate outcomes in 1942 as a result of that, whereas you perhaps don't see that quite as much in the Royal Navy, because obviously they have quite an experience base from the First World War, and a lot of the officers who are now in fairly senior positions, everywhere from captains on up to admirals in the Royal Navy, were junior officers or maybe captains in the First World War. So they've seen combat, they've seen how things work, they have a better idea about how to actually, lead men, command ships, than someone who's just learned it all in theory and in peacetime. That's not to say there weren't some officers who managed to work their way up the ladder in peacetime in the Royal Navy who were, to be honest, not worth the gold on their shoulder boards, but because there certainly were some like that, but they weren't quite as common. Now, there are ways to avoid this happening. You can have a stricter meritocracy system even in peacetime. You can try and cut out patronage and political pressures and favours. You can accept that, encourage officers to be a lot more free-thinking and just accept the fact that that's going to mean a slightly higher repair bill over time. But it would take a very brave, Commander-in-Chief or First Lord of the Admiralty or whatever, and politicians who actually understood what the heck was going on, to sustain that for extended periods of time during times of peace, which is why, as I say, the longer peace goes on, the more these problems tend to arise. Blue Marlin 81 asks, Drac, could you discuss the concept of spaced armour and shell decapping in naval combat, and specifically as it applies to the armour scheme of the Littorio class? From what you've said in the past, you appear to be somewhat sceptical of its effectiveness. Okay, well, first off, for those of you who really love formulas and technical explanations, there's quite a long essay called Decapping Revisited on the NAV website. That's Nathan Oken's website. So if you want to have a look at that in extreme detail, then please, obviously, feel free to do so. But to try and summarise that into a few minutes, the idea of decapping belts on warships, especially battleships, effectively runs on the basis of how shells work. So a naval shell, you're fairly familiar with, sort of cylindrical thing, long pointy front. Well, by World War I, World War II, the pointy front bit is the armour-piercing cap. Well, and the windshield, but that's a separate issue. But effectively, look at the cross-sectional profile of a armour-piercing shell at some point. You'll have the windshield, an armour-piercing cap, and then the body of the shell itself. And the body of the shell itself actually looks a lot more like a pistol bullet, actually somewhat snub-nosed. The very hard armour-piercing cap that's attached to it is attached by some form of, well, for lack of a better term, adhesive, usually solder or something like that, because it's of a completely different hardness to the body of the shell, so you can't make it as a one-piece thing. And there's all sorts of mechanics behind armour penetration, which is the reason for that. The windshield is there for aerodynamic purposes, but anyway, the point of it is that for a decapping belt, the idea is that this belt, and there's, let's say, some formulas that dictate the exact thicknesses, but the decapping belt has to be thick enough to cause enough damage to the whatever it is that's joining the armour-piercing cap and the shell, such that that joint shears, is broken. So the cap is knocked off, if you like. But the cap doesn't just disappear. I mean, first, it's a convex on concave join, so it's not going to easily come off anyway, and it's got a fair amount of inertia and momentum going in a particular direction, which is not going to go away very easily. And the whole thing's happening very quickly. Now, if the decapping plate is thick enough to cause this break, then the shell enters a gap between the decapping plate and the main armour belt. And what the formulas tell you, apart from the necessary thickness of the decapping plate in the first place, is how much space needs to be as an interval between the decapping plate and the main armour belt. And this is proportional to the diameter of the shell, because obviously diameter, apart from anything, the diameter of the shell also has a certain effect on the length of the shell. But basically, you need enough space that between the two that the effect of the decapping plate, i.e. the shearing of the join between the armour-piercing cap and the body of the shell, can actually have some kind of effect, i.e. the cap can start to come off. And then you have just a shell without the armour-piercing cap hitting the main armour plate. It's now far, far less capable of penetrating the armour, so you need less armour to deal with the incoming shell, and thus overall, in theory, you can save weight. Because, for example, in the Italian system, a bit under 3 inches of decapping plate and an 11-inch main belt, i.e. a sum total of just under 14 inches of armour, was supposed to be able to defeat anything up to the Italian's own 15-inch high-velocity shells at, relatively speaking, close range, which would be beyond just 13.8 inches of armour straight up if it was just a solid plate. The compromise, of course, being that your decapping plate is going to take some damage regardless of what happens, and there's extra volume involved, plus supporting structure, etc., etc. But in theory, it's a good idea. The problems come in with what kind of shell are you designing it against, because if you design the decapping plate and the intervening gap to deal with, let's say, a 15-inch shell, that's fine. But if then someone toodles up with a 16 or even worse, an 18-inch shell, and you didn't design it to deal with that, well, let's take an 18-inch shell as an example. Well, that shell's going to come steaming through. It's going to plough through your 2.8 inches of decapping plate like it's not even there. Armour-piercing cap's still going to be on when it hits the 11-inch belt, and obviously don't need to tell you an 11-inch belt's not going to provide you a tremendous amount of resistance against a nearly intact, nearly proper velocity 18.1-inch shell. And this is why the Iowa class's 1.5-inch, I think, STS plate is not a decapping plate. It's stated in some places, but it's not actually a decapping plate. It wasn't designed that way. It definitely wouldn't function that way against the kind of shells that Iowa was supposed to be dealing with. And if you read the Decapping Revisited article, again, it's explained in extreme detail why this is the case. Now, the reason that I have some issues with the Italian scheme is two reasons. One, they never actually tested it against a 15-inch shell. They tested it against a smaller caliber shell whose energy profile had been adjusted to simulate a 15-inch shell striking at a given range, which is fine if you're testing a solid armour plate, but because, obviously, as I said, the thickness of the decapping plate and the space in between it and the main belt is proportional to the diameter of the shell in question, if you use a smaller shell, all you are proving, regardless of how much energy you put into it, is whether or not that will work against the caliber of shell you've actually fired at it. It doesn't prove anything about a 15-inch shell, because it doesn't matter if you're firing the thing at Mach 7 or 50 miles an hour, the spacing is, as a proportional to that. Okay, fair enough. If you fire at Mach 7, it's probably just going to go straight through. Whatever, but you get the idea. So that's one thing. It never had an actual practical proof against an actual full caliber 15-inch shell. And secondly, the gap between the decapping plate and the main plate is far, far, far too thin for it to work by the standard formulas. Now, the Italians apparently, according to the more recent works, anticipated that, because that is one of the other disadvantages of a decapping plate. You need a fairly chunky bit of space, which is a lot of volume that gets used up. And they attempted to address this by filling the intervening space with concrete, which would obviously increase the density of the material or the medium that's between the two armour belts, or the decapping belt and the armour belt, and that would accelerate the process of the cap being removed from the shell. Okay, that's fine. But then you run into the issue of how dense is the concrete. because the gap itself is just a fraction under 10 inches. Now, if the concrete is too light, then it's not going to have enough effect to fully decap the shell, at which point the whole thing is pointless and you're effectively down near as much as makes no difference to 11 and a bit inches of armour protection, which isn't going to be enough to stop practically any serious battleship gun in World War II. If, on the other hand, it's solid concrete, well, if you run the density of concrete, okay, it's a bit less than steel, but if you run the density of 10 inches of concrete, plus the 11 inches of belt armour, plus the 2.8 inches of decapping plate, and you add all those together, well, it turns out if it's solid concrete, then for the same weight, you could just slap, an 18-inch armour belt on the side of the ship, and it will be immune to practically anything you throw at it anyway, without all this fancy nonsense. And so those are the two extremes, and the Italian sources indicate that the concrete that was put in was foamed, so it's not solid. But the thing that I've not been able to come across yet, perhaps Italian viewers might know, is what exactly was the density of this foamed concrete? Because they'll reach a point where, yes, the foam concrete will have the decapping effect, but as the concrete gets denser and denser, as there's less and less air in it, you will hit a point where actually it's just more efficient to just use sheer slab steel instead of this fancy arrangement. And if the density of the concrete sits between those two, whatever those values would happen to be, between the lower bound of, just dense enough to actually decap a 15-inch shell or 16-inch shell, but also light enough that its equivalent mass in steel wouldn't offer as good protection, then it's a working scheme, albeit a little complex. But if it falls below that level, then it's pointless, it's just dead weight. If it falls below the density required, and if it's above the density required, as I said, then at that point you might as well just go for slab armour. The thing is, we don't know, at least I don't know at this point, and I haven't been able to find any sources that will tell me what exactly the density of the concrete was to finish those calculations. And given that, as I say, they tested it with a sub-caliber shell, at the moment, as an engineer, I have to have my doubts as to whether or not it would have been fully effective. Or, if it was going to be effective, was it the most efficient solution? Because both of those things are quite important for battleships. £300 Nick asks, in this video, this is the Tassafaronga one, you show a bunch of torpedoes hitting the island. Did they detonate, or is there a possibility there's still some monster ship killers on a sunny vacation beach of Guadalcanal? For the most part, due to the beach profile of Guadalcanal, the torpedoes just rode up onto the sand. As you can see here, here is an actual unexploded torpedo on a beach on Guadalcanal in 1942. Quite merrily being a supreme danger to anybody in a several 100-foot radius. Because these things were still alive. They could detonate, which is, as I say, not pleasant. Now, one of the ways, apart from people finding them like this on the ground, that we know about this was that in the aftermath of the Battle of Tassafaronga, there were scout aircraft that obviously flew over the area, and they could see the silvery glints of torpedoes that had fetched up on the beaches. So yeah, for the most part, they didn't detonate. As for whether or not there are any still left, I couldn't say for 100% certain, but I would both doubt it and hope not, because, torpedoes are not exactly easy to miss when they're sitting like this, and as I say, they are fairly dangerous. So one would hope that either the Japanese or the Americans or whoever was in control of that beach at the time or thereafter would have had the good sense to dispose of them before they got buried or whatever. But at the same time, I suppose there is a theoretical chance that one of them got missed, or maybe one of them was running a bit deeper and ploughed into some sand just offshore and ended up getting buried with the incoming tide or whatever. So there's a small possibility there's a Long Lance or a Mark 14 or 15 or whatever, or several, potentially buried somewhere either on or just off of the shores of Guadalcanal. So yeah, memo to self: if I ever go to Guadalcanal, stick to the southern and western beaches. Bill Brockman asks, regarding casement-mounted secondary armament such as the 5-inch 51 caliber that some older US battleships used throughout World War II, did such batteries benefit from modern fire control systems being installed, and how was this done? To varying degrees, yes. So when it comes to the secondary guns, whether or not they had access to central director firing and fire control systems was a bit of a floating question in the First World War. I mean, to be honest, in the First World War, especially in the first half of it, there was question over whether some battleships' main guns had access to central battery director firing and rangefinder computers, etc. But these systems were installed as time went on, and then also systems were installed to help guide the secondary armament. Now, once you get into the interwar period, it largely depends on the ship as to whether or not those systems were upgraded. Pretty much all ships would have those fire control systems upgraded at least once, usually in the mid to late 1920s. But then you get into the 1930s, and then where you get, as you say, the modern fire control systems, that starts to get a bit more difficult. Some ships in some navies would have casement batteries that did have, mid to late 1930s secondary battery fire control systems linked into them, but it wasn't as common. Most secondary batteries that got the mid to late 1930s fire control systems installed would either be the new build treaty battleships, modernized ships, the Italian ships, the Warspite, Renown, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, and for the most part those modernized ships were having their casements replaced by turret mounted secondaries rather than keeping the original casements. The older ships tended not to have as thorough secondary battery upgrades, and of course with the US Navy that really hadn't started a major modernization program in the mid to late 30s and was only just getting to it when when World War II broke out for them in late 41. As we know, they largely, when they took ships in for modernization, the older battleships, they replaced the 5-inch 51 casement guns with 5-inch 38 secondaries in turrets or mounts, at which point, they got access to modern fire control equipment, but the casement guns didn't because they were no longer there. So I'd say it's a little bit of a sliding scale question there for the reasons I just described. But if you're looking at any point at any ship in World War II, there will be some, like, say, for example, USS Idaho. Take a ship as a not quite random example, but in 1942, while it's patrolling up and down the west coast, it's not going to have anything like the latest and greatest fire control for its secondary batteries. But if you discount ships that have been hauled in, refitted, and had their casement guns stripped out, by the time you get to 43, 44, 45, something like the Battle of Surigao Strait time period, then at that point, probably a reasonable number of US ships that still have casement guns at that point will have had some kind of updated fire control fitted to them. And then, of course, you have weird cases like the Omahas, which have both turrets and casemates. The whatever fire control system they have is going to apply as much to their casement guns as is to the turret guns. And in terms of how it's done, well, it feeds information the same way as information is fed to the main turret guns. The only real difference being that on some of the casement guns, the adjustments for both bearing and elevation might have to be done by hand cranking rather than using a powered option, but that's not necessarily applicable across everything. But generally, Casemate guns tend to be a little bit more manual than the main turrets. Jonathan Smith asks, was there anything in the Washington or London naval treaties that would have limited a nation from continuing to build battleship guns and turrets, say to install as coastal defences, or battleship armour plate to protect the same in order to keep the industries alive during the building holiday? And if not, how do you think some signatories would have reacted to one of their members basically laying down stone battleships throughout the holiday? Strictly speaking, no. Although, well, I mean, two things. One, the Washington and London treaties were designed in large part to try and mitigate the overall expense. So whilst there's nothing within the treaties that stops you building more battleship guns and turrets to stick into coastal defences, as long as you don't build them in the areas that the treaties say you can't put additional coastal defences, it would kind of go against the idea of, you know, signing up to the treaty in order to save money in the first place. But let's say you were trying to secretly build up a reserve of capital ship parts, which I think is what you're suggesting. You could probably get away with the guns and turrets issues, definitely. I mean, apart from anything, you're not going to be building the barbettes, the full depth barbette magazine, turret hoist arrangements, etc., that you would need to fit on a battleship. And you've also got the slight issue of, if you were planning on lifting these guns and turrets away and putting them on a battleship at some point in the future, you'd have to build it on fortifications that were located in such a manner that you could actually then take these things away, because you tend to transport, if you were going to build like a twin turret installation, due to the issues with building on land, you'd probably have to transport it up in sections. You'd bring the guns up individually, you'd bring the turret in bits and construct it all on site, and you're not going to want to take it all apart to bring it down again. So that could pose some interesting issues. The armour plate, again, strictly, there's nothing to stop you doing that. Although I think if you did start building large amounts of armour plate, people might start looking at you a bit suspiciously, because they'd be looking and going, well, why aren't you just using concrete? It's cheaper and easier. There's something going on here. Why are you doing this? And again, it's quite expensive. But apart from people getting a little bit suspicious of it all, yeah, I can't think of offhand of anything specific in the treaty restrictions that would prevent you from doing so. So if you were to, let's say, as Britain, turn around and go, oh, okay, well, we're going to replace all our Martello towers and other Napoleonic era coastal fortifications with a bunch of, you know, twin 15-inch gun installations, or even twin 16-inch or triple 16-inch or whatever, you could do that. It would cost an absolute fortune, but I guess that's one, if somewhat expensive, way of keeping your gun and armour manufacturing industries alive. But as I said, I think people, if you did it on a mass scale, people would look at you suspiciously generally, and especially if you started using the expensive and difficult to produce battleship armour plate instead of just massive amounts of concrete and stone, people would definitely twig that something is potentially going on here that they don't like. Aerospace Gaming asks, have there been any instances in which a warship of destroyer, escort or larger size have been damaged or flooded so severely that the main deck level is submerged and yet the ship was saved? And if so, what happened to her? I'm not aware of a ship that had its entire main deck level submerged and still was saved, because, to be perfectly honest, if a ship gets to that point, i.e. the entire hull is underwater, yeah, at that point you've pretty much lost all buoyancy. I mean, you might have a few unflooded compartments remaining, but you're going to have a lot of water pouring down through hatchways and ventilation ducts and other things where you really don't want water pouring down. It's incredibly unlikely at that point that your ship's going to be saved. Now, there have been ships that have had partial main deck submersions going on and have been saved. I mean, Seydlitz is possibly an example of that at points. One that comes to mind, again, as a very, very close-run thing is actually USS Pennsylvania. Made it through Pearl Harbor, absolutely fine, but in 1945, perhaps people aren't necessarily aware, hit by a Japanese torpedo, and as you can see in this picture, that's not a healthy amount of freeboard for a battleship to have left. I mean, you've got obviously her pumps going full tilt. You can see you've got other ships alongside their pumps going full tilt, and you can see from the men standing there, this ship now has less freeboard than a good number of monitors and other ironclads of the 1860s and 1870s. So this is about as close as you're going to get, I think, to a major warship actually having main deck completely under and still being saved, because, of course, Pennsylvania was saved, but as you can tell, it was not exactly an easy job. It was a very close-run thing. You see this kind of thing, and this is the kind of photo you usually associate with either a salvage of a ship or this is a ship in the process of being abandoned photo. At some point, I've probably got to do a video on this, because, to pull a ship back from quite literally, as you can see, the very brink of being a complete loss, that's a fair bit of impressive work there by the crew, but who, all to be fair, in this photo seem thoroughly unimpressed with everything that's going on. And finally, Kia Finning doesn't so much ask a question, as this is in the Tassafaronga video, as makes quite an interesting statement -- relates a story, which I will now proceed to relate to you. They say, my great-grandfather was on the New Orleans when she took the torpedo in the bow that detonated the forward magazines. He was a loader on the port side 1.1-inch gun above the bridge, and had thrown out his back earlier because of it. He was down in sickbay, which was in the bow, for a couple of days recuperating. As the battle started, the doctor in charge had ordered all the people who could move out. He was on his way out, he thought somewhere around or behind the barbette of turret number 2, when the magazines went up. He said the blast threw him probably 20 foot down the corridor and knocked him out. What I'll always remember from the story is he said the blast blew the shoes off his feet. He came to from one of his shipmates waking him up and carrying him further aft. He was ordered up on deck to help lighten the ship, and when he got up on deck, the entire forward part of the ship was a massive fireball, and it was absolutely pandemonium all around. He said he distinctly remembered there being body parts all over the place. The rest of the night he helped throw anything that could go over the side. Apparently the adrenaline of the situation allowed him to go on like that for some time. He was medically discharged from the service in early 1943 when he got back stateside for treatment. He passed in 2013 at 92. But I've always thought that had that doctor not ordered those men out of sickbay when he did, it's very likely I would not be writing this today. Now, the reason I read that particular one to you is because this is one of the things I love about running the channel. You get all sorts of people, some people who actually have served in the Navy and been through combat experiences, telling their stories, and in other cases, especially obviously for stuff like World War I and World War II, more often the children, grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren of veterans who've been through some of the experiences that I'm telling the story of, recounting what their ancestors did and what they experienced, what they were told. And this, I think, is incredibly important because, this story is not going to be found in pretty much any of the history books, because this is something that's been shared within a family. I'm going to guess probably hasn't been asked for by the author of a book looking at the Guadalcanal campaign or anything. Maybe it has, who knows? But, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of these little stories in the comment section all through the channel's videos. The vast majority of them are, I'm 99% sure have never been told before to the general public. And, as I said, I absolutely love this part of the channel. It's bringing out parts of history whilst they're still in living memory that otherwise could well be forgotten, or perhaps if they're not forgotten, are never told to a wider audience. They just remain family stories for as long as people within that family want to remember them. And so, yeah, if you either have served in a Navy and you've got a story of what you did at the time, or you have a family member who did serve in the Navy and they told you about stuff that they did, please do continue to, put these things down in the comments. I love reading them. I'm sure other people love reading them, and it means that at least in some way those are now preserved for people in the future to have a look at and to read. At some point I might start going through the comments and finding all these stories and putting them together, probably on the website, because obviously, people are sharing these things freely. I don't feel like that should be separately monetized by me, but as you know, I do have the Drachinifel website, so as long as people don't object, then perhaps at some point later this year I would like to start gathering those and putting them together on the website in a centralized location, for people to read, so that this history is preserved for everyone. And maybe at some point, if enough of them build up, and I'm pretty sure from the channel I've been going for several years that there are maybe even enough of them already, then if people want them in a printed format, then perhaps I can arrange for some kind of print-on-demand book to be made available. But I will say right here, right now, I don't intend to make any profit off of it whatsoever. So it would either be here's a link, you can purchase it from whatever print-on-demand service exists, and you'll get it at cost. There'll be no money coming my way from it. Or alternatively, some kind of general charity, maybe for maritime crew, sailors, etc., could be agreed on where funding could go to, but obviously that would increase the overall price of the book, which would make it less accessible. So it's just an idea I'm putting together. I certainly want to collate everything on the website, but you can let me know what you think in the comments below, especially obviously if you're one of those people who either has shared a story or would like to share a story that you'd like to see commemorated. And that brings us to an end to the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening. No particular channel admin for this week, other than to say that in the process of finalising the tour for the US, it's come to my attention that I don't actually have a name for it yet. So, in the comments below, if you have a funny-amusing-sarcastic kind of name that could be put on a t-shirt, then let me know in the comments below, and we might see which one is the most popular.